Hello everybody. I am Dr. Debhuti Brahmachari, teaching in the Department of Political Science, and today I am taking a video lecture on the topic Good Governance, the Road to Development in India. So currently we must have seen and we must have heard as researchers of political science that the mantra to development, the keystone to development is good governance. So this is a short presentation and a lecture on how good governance has helped to develop the framework of India and how Indian road ahead, keeping in mind the MDGs, the SDGs, how are we moving forward when we look into the structure of good governance and how has the government contributed to the same. So when we talk about the word good governance, largely divided into two parts, good and governance. 1992, the World Bank came up with this central idea, and it largely emphasized on the idea that if the world needs to create a sustaining environment, we need to foster the spirit of strong and equitable development. Therefore, the 1992 understanding of World Bank sees that good governance is possible and is the successful mantra when we bring in the idea of a citizen-centric governance. So the content of the presentation the presentation is divided into the following structures. We will move on to the understanding of development. How has development been intrinsically related and linked to the idea of governance or good governance in India especially? Then what are the pillars of good governance? We all know that the United Nations has categorically divided that good governance sustains because of the important 8 pillars that we will do in detail as we discuss. Then, being a part of the initiatives, how has the government been a contributor? What are the essential initiatives that has been taken in our country, which has led to the next part, that is a citizen-centric governance model. So what are the various programs? Few of the programs will be highlighted as the presentation moves on, and then we conclude the presentation that whether we have been able to move towards the path of development when it comes to India through this ever-emphasizing structure of good governance. So looking into the conceptual understanding of good governance, as I've already mentioned when I started the presentation, good governance was defined by the World Bank that it is central to create and sustain the environment which will be strong and equitable. So the development which needs to be equitable in nature needs to be sustained by the concept of governance which is good in nature. So the word which is very essential here is the idea of welfare. Welfare of the citizens is something that good governance is deeply linked into. So when we talk about governance, governance is the process, the system, the structures, through the organizations, the society, whoever is following the structure, the process and system needs to understand how the system will lead to the idea of good governance. So good governance can hence be defined as a set of values through which a public institution conducts public affairs, manages public resources in a way that it essentially respects human rights, the rule of law, and essentially the needs of the society. And in the presentation, one can see that when we talk about a capable government, the idea of good governance is extremely important. It brings into action a lot of other factors such as improving the capital market, the investment climate, the stability of the bureaucratic system is essentially very, very important. The economic and political power structure, which are the key pillars for the running or the sustenance of a governance model, and very importantly, the public services, the quality of public services. So thinkers like Liu et al. Have defined that when you talk about quality of public services, good governance is the key towards delivering such public services, whether it is the local level, whether it is the national level, quality of formulated policies, what is the ability that one is trying to exercise power So how are the decisions taken? Are these decisions for the good of the people? Once these decisions are for the well-being or the welfare of the people, then only the country is able to achieve its goals for an effective governance. So the highlighted point in this segment is we talk about good governance today with the understanding that when we have less government, better governance. This is the current mantra that is going everywhere. A government which is less and the governance which is higher is actually the idea of good governance. So the governance is a complete process, the continuous process, while the government is the organization or the structure which helps in building up the idea of good governance. Hence, good governance is therefore considered as a key and essential ingredient of social economic development, especially in developing countries. So as the presentation talks about keeping in mind the idea of India, we are trying to see that how the idea that World Bank had envisaged that developing nations can only grow ahead. The World Bank indicators that has stated that one needs to follow the governance indicators, especially in the developing countries, is the idea of good governance. So lastly, when we look into the idea that it aims in mobilizing the people of the country, it's a very, very important point because we are trying to talk about something at the end of this presentation, that is the idea of citizen-centric governance. So it aims in mobilizing the people of a country in the best direction possible, ensuring a sustainable development. So this idea today of sustainable development, this idea today of achieving SDG, something which is the highlight of the coming sustainable development parameter, is the 2030 goals, and India stands at a very, very important position where it needs to undertake the 2030 agenda in various spheres, especially the socio-economic development. So as a developing country which is trying to move forward within the growth, within the development structure of the international politics, keeping in mind the 2030 agenda is very important for a country like India, and therefore the ultimate rule of good governance, or the ultimate idea of good governance, the framework of good governance, is something that India needs to strengthen and has been working for the same. In fact, in India, 25th December has been declared and is being commemorated as the Good Governance Day. So we often see that there's a Good Governance Week that is celebrated, and this has been declared on the birth anniversary of our former respectable Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee ji. So several events take place, the organization, the public structures celebrate this Good Governance Week, enhancing citizen awareness, enhancing the idea of accountability in governance and other governmental procedures. So good governance, when we say again and again, the word values come into action. So when we say that the World Bank has defined good governance in terms of traditions and institutions by which authority in a country is exercised, it also includes the following. It tries to say that the processes by which governments are selected and monitored and replaced, one needs to understand the mechanisms through which governments are being selected, they are being monitored, they are being replaced. The recent democratic voting festival that we've just witnessed in our country a few days back has been one of the most exciting highlights of the country currently, and how the governments have come into action, how the voting power, how the citizens have come into the forefront, how are the representatives selected, how does the majority come into place. All of this becomes very important when we try to understand the way the governance institutions are working in the country. Secondly, the capacity of the government to effectively formulate and implement sound policies. We all know that the government structure is there ultimately to successfully implement these policies. So with the changing scenarios that we are having both nationally and internationally, globally, one needs to understand that when we try to direct the country towards the best direction, we need to understand that the policies which have been formulated need to be effectively and efficiently implemented and delivered as well. And the idea of citizen-centric governance, which I'm reiterating again and again, is where we look into the welfare of the people, we look into the welfare of all segments of the societies, the respect of the citizens, the state institutions need to interact and hold strong relationships, frameworks with the citizens in every part of the country. So there are several governance indicators that are used in a lot of researches that one will see when we talk about public administration, that the rule of law needs to be very, very strong. Corruption is the biggest flaw that needs to be dealt, and good governance is a big blow to the idea of corruption. The effectiveness of the government is something that the good governance indicator talks about. Quality is something that the idea of good governance focuses on, because the word good, the normative understanding of good, is implemented in the idea of effective qualitative policies. Accountability, transparency, these are the key indicators, these are the key values that one tries to look into when one assesses the idea of good governance. And the political stability is very, very important, what one needs to understand. So India definitely has been scaling up when it comes to reaching the parameters of ensuring good governance, but simultaneously it has been dealing with a lot of issues that act as a hurdle or is detrimental to the development structure. So when we talk about factors like corruption, in the recent 2022 corruption index, sadly India ranked 85th out of the 180 countries that were there. So these concerns are highlighted, that how the governance road comes with such obstacles. So after this brief theoretical understanding, I'll quickly scan through some of the important factors that one needs to understand when we talk about the conceptual understanding of good governance. So this word governance is obviously not new, though the limelight of this word today has become very, very strong. But this word is quite old in its nature, and it has in fact been derived from the Greek word meaning to steer. So steer, when we steer the steering wheel of a car, similarly we steer our nation towards growth, towards development, towards all other socio-economic factors that lead to the welfare of the citizen. So this word, this concept, this understanding is very old as the human civilization. This process of decision making is not something that we are suddenly talking about or has gained attention. It is an administrative process, and it is an administrative process which is oriented with several other factors. So both the formal and the informal actors within the working of the country, within the decision making of the country, within the implementation of these decisions is something one needs to understand and focus when we talk about good governance. So the various formal and informal structures that work within this idea of good governance is something that we need to keep in mind whenever we try to understand the success or the failure, or we try to decode the idea of good governance. So whenever we say that we are moving towards the 2030 agenda of development, of sustainability, we need to understand that all of this agenda is working with the basic idea of the welfare of people. So what is the plan of action for the people? So when we look into the plan of action, all kinds of formal and informal structures that are a part of it, that help in the decision-making process, is what one needs to understand. So the United Nations defined governance as the rules of the political system to solve conflict between actors and adopt decisions, legality part of it. It has also been used to describe the proper functioning of institutions and their acceptance by the public. So the legitimacy is something one needs to understand, that we know that institutions are there, processes are there, systems are there, but how is the legitimacy achieved? How is the institution legitimate enough to take forward the policies, the working of the structure of the government? And therefore, the effectiveness of the government is scaled when we look into the consensus. So the democratic means of participation, ensures that the effectiveness of the government is maintained, the power is given to the citizens to hold the representatives directly accountable. So governance, one can define, occurs in three broad ways when we try to understand in today's context. Whenever we're talking about development, we need to understand that governance is a multifaceted concept. So the various partners or the various mechanisms through which good governance or the governance structures functions today are: number one, through the various public-private partnerships, the various networks that are there. So the people who are a part of this public-private partnership, the community organizations, the collaboration between them is the first sort of understanding when we look into the partners of good governance. Secondly, market, very, very important, very essential. How does the market play a role within the development structure of the country, keeping in mind the goals of the market, that is their own competition and their own profit. So how are the resources allocated? How does the government operate? What are the government regulations? How does the market add up to the strengthening of the governance of that particular nation or the country? So what are the different ways of partnership that can be brought about when we talk about a sustainable development? And the top-down approach, obviously, the government, the bureaucracy, the structures, the various processes, how are they trying to make a governance work? So this idea of partnership is something one needs to understand is the key agenda for sustainable development. The spirit of global solidarity also rises from such kind of partnership. The interlinkages, the integrated nature of the various global sustainable goals are only possible with such kind of partnerships that we can see in the form of PPPs, in the form and contribution of the market, and especially the role of the government or the state or the bureaucracy. This tripartite relationship, maybe we can use that term, how this works to envision the goals of the country, how it envisions to bring about a world that is much more equitable, more justifiable, looks into the idea of social protection, looks into the idea of respect for human rights, human dignity, justice, equality, respect for different cultures, diversities, opportunity to all genders. Such welfare ideals, such welfare policies, such welfare visions that the world or the country looks forward is only possible when we have a networking which is sustained, which is inclusive, and which moves together for a single goal, that is the idea of a citizen-centric governance. Hence, the word that now gets connected is development and governance. We've looked into a lot of these commitments that the UN has been talking about, the UN has been questioning about, that how are the nations who have been a part of the MDGs in 2015, how are they looking into when it comes to the 2030 sustainable goals. And we know that India is still struggling in a lot of the key areas when it talks about sustainable development goals. So the World Bank in its report, Governance and Development, defined that good governance is an essential complement to, number one, sound economic policies, as well as creating a sustaining environment which will lead to equitable development that we have already stated. But when we talk about this development, we need to understand that this gets looked into three different segments, that is the economic development. So when we talk about economic development, we need to understand the fair allocation of resources and how the country is able to achieve a stable economic growth after the allocation of resources and services. Adding to this is the agenda of social development. So the values of fairness, justice, equitability in a society, removing of all discriminations, whether it is based on caste, religion, wealth, gender, etc., is where the governance needs to bring its effectiveness when we talk about social development. And lastly, political development. We all know that democracy lies in the heart of good governance. The central pillar, the central heartbeat of a democracy is through the idea of good governance. So when we talk about democracy, when we talk about we the people, for the people, we are focusing on the welfare of the people. We are focusing on how this economic development within a nation, within the country, will be able to bring fair allocation of resources to the public, to the citizen, how this democracy, how this pillar of democracy, through the instruments of good governance, will be able to bring about social development, equality, law, democratization of the processes, make the scope of administration more accountable, more transparent to the people, and how the governance structure, the government, will politically try to strengthen the ideas of good governance. And therefore, we had focused in the starting that we are looking towards something called as the process of less government and better governance. Moving ahead, these are some important quotations that I have outlined. You can see the international organizations such as World Bank, ADB, Canada Institute of Governance, the UNDP, all of these have been focusing and have been trying to instill the goals of good governance, whether it is managing development of resources, the political development, the economic development, whether they are trying to question how power is exercised within such countries. And the idea that the process through which the governance is taking place and the way the decision making processes are happening is where one needs to understand how good governance comes into action. So the exercise of economic, political and administrative authority to manage a country's affair at all levels is what UNDP calls governance is. It compromises the various processes, the mechanisms, and very important, the citizens and groups, the communities that are able to articulate their interest, exercise their legal rights, meet their obligations, and lastly, mediate their differences. So one can understand that all these global institutions are talking about the success of good governance, are talking about that the key to development globally as well as nationally is through good governance. So, the United Nations, we all are aware of these 8 pillars. One can see that when UN talked about good governance, it made very, very clear that a country is able to achieve its report card of good governance when it is able to help strengthen these 8 pillars that is visible on the right side of the image. And on the left side, one can see that the Niti Aayog, in fact, recently also talked about the new definitions of good governance in India. So we'll quickly first go over to the 8 pillars of good governance. So when one talks about good governance, the essential, the essence is participation. So we know that a people-oriented, a people-centered governance, the government which is for the citizen, the government where people are at the center is something that good governance envisions and is the centrifugal force for governance to run effectively. So the citizens coming and participating through democratic structures is extremely important when we talk about good governance. Secondly, the rule of law. The impartial legal framework is the baseline when we talk about good governance. The rule of law, the strengthening of rule of law, the legal procedures, the legal factors are extremely important when we talk about the effectiveness of good governance and what is the accessibility. How far or how quick is the idea of good governance or the idea of law available to every person within the nation. So rule of law tries to enforce the idea of human rights. Without rule of law, politics will follow completely the principle of something known as the Matsya Nyaya, the powerful of the powerful. So the biggest fish, the powerful fish will end up eating all the smaller fishes. That is, the strongest will prevail. So extremely important as the second pillar is the rule of law. Third, consensus. When we are talking about the citizens' participation, when we are talking about a people-centered governance, consensus orientation of the citizen is very important. One needs to understand that the governance structures that are working need to fulfill the consensus, keeping in mind the wishes, the needs of the citizens. Therefore, this kind of decision making ensures that even if everyone does not achieve what they want to the fullest, at least a common minimum guarantee can be achieved by everyone, which will not be detrimental to anyone. So it will be positive to them. Hence, it will always try to mediate the different interests within the sections of the society so that a broad consensus can be brought about, and finally the best interest can be upheld through the structures of good governance. Next, equity and efficiency. We know that the two E's of governance are definitely the idea of having an effective government and equitable government. So the various processes, the various institutions looking towards the stability of a society is only possible through an effective and efficient government, through the two E's of governance. So these institutions should be able to produce results that meet the needs of the community. Various resources of the community should be effectively used such that maximum output can be delivered to all sections of the society. So when we talk about delivery of services today, we say that the success of delivery of services is only possible when we move on to the last mile. So the effectiveness, the efficiency can only be marked when it reaches the last mile of the country. Responsiveness, we have multiple stakeholders when we talk about good governance. So all the partners, all the stakeholders, all the institutions, the segments, the processes that are involved in serving the people need to be responsible, need to be answerable for their actions at all times. So all the stakeholders need to follow the time foundations, need to be accountable and responsible for their respective actions. Accountability, very important when we are talking about pillars. The ideas of transparency, responsiveness, accountability all go hand in hand. The power that has been given to the structures, the power that has been given to the institution is only for the betterment of the people, the welfare of the people. Therefore, the government has to be 100% accountable to its own people, to its own citizens, all governmental institutions. In fact, the partners, the stakeholders, whether it is the private segment, the private market, the private sector, or the civil society, the community participation, are equally accountable to the public and the various institutional structures. Accountability is in fact the key of good governance, and therefore each is 100% accountable when they talk about the idea of good governance. So all these 8 pillars are somehow exemplified even in the past in various theoretical understandings of the running of the Indian government. I mean, the ancient texts such as Kautilya's Arthashastra in the 3rd century BC also focused with the essence of welfare of people. So it is often stated that the goal of good governance, the essence of good governance has always been there in India, reigning from the idea of Kautilya's Arthashastra, where he made it very clear that the welfare of the people, the goal is what the king has to work towards. Similarly, the text of Bhagavad Gita has also provided a lot of examples where it talks about effective leadership, talks about dutifulness, talks about self-realization and good governance at the core of its structure. In fact, the most important documentation of our freedom, the Indian Constitution, is based on the idea of a sovereign, socialist, secular and democratic republic which is committed to the idea of democracy. So all these examples and these ideas, the theoretical understanding, make it very clear that even today when we talk about the SDGs of 2030, they are directly linked to the notion of good governance. So Niti Aayog recently tried to bring in the idea of a 7 pillar of effective governance within the country. So when it talked about the 7 pillars, it focused on number 1, pro people. So the government structure that fulfills the aspiration of the society as well as the individual is obviously a pro-people fond of governance. Proactivity in anticipation of and response to citizen needs. So one needs to be proactive. You need to understand the requirements of the citizen much beforehand so that actions can be taken keeping in mind the goals that one needs to achieve. Participation, again, the central force, the central element of involving the citizen, all forms of participation, whether it is from the public or from the civil society or from the private sector, all kinds of participation acts as the tool of strengthening good governance. Empowerment, very important. When we talk about empowering, we look into the gender relations and women in all aspects. Niti Aayog has highlighted this idea that women need to come up into the strongest position of governance and lead as leaders when we talk about the development of the country. Inclusion, we are very well aware that when we talk about a democratic setup, we are talking about a democratic governance. Including everybody is the essence. All kinds of groups need to be a part within this structure of governance. There cannot be any form of discrimination at all. And therefore, the equality for all, mostly in today's realm, is again being questioned, and the idea of good governance is being tried to look into the role of the youth, the opportunities that are given to the youth, because we all are aware that the youth of the nation are the ones who need to steer ahead the country's path towards an effective rule. Therefore, when we talk about equality, what are the opportunities that is being provided to the youth of the country, and what is their role? And lastly, transparency, very important pillar, the accountability factor, the transparency factor, making the government both responsive and visible. So we now move on to a very important section when we are trying to focus on the various initiatives that are taken in India, that have been taken in India. So it's a quick glance of various processes maybe, or forms of, one can say, changes that have been brought about within the governance structure of India. So number one, 2005 brought about a very powerful tool into the hands of the public, that is the right to information. So right to information, the RTI brings into the picture that the citizens now have the power to get information, the freedom of information for the citizen. As a result, the pillars of transparency, accountability, responsiveness, all are getting strengthened. So the government is now answerable directly to its citizen and to the community needs. Therefore, RTI tried to bring in the concept of openness, transparency, accountability in public administration, and therefore it is obvious that the governance pillars are being strengthened through this Act of 2005. So the government is now much more open to public scrutiny. The government needs to be much more accountable, much more responsible when it comes to its action. Various legal reforms that have taken place over the years. So the central government, in fact, roughly has scrapped a lot of the orthodox almost 1500 obsolete rules and laws that have been working, which hindered transparency, and therefore these orthodox mechanisms have been, one can say, overthrown so that efficiency and effectiveness can be maintained, leading to greater transparency and accountability. So one of the key reform areas have always been the criminal justice system and the procedural laws, which have tried to focus on a very important idea of the pre-institution mediation. Following the legal reforms, the Model Police Act of 2015 also talks about modernizing police forces, and therefore police reforms are something that has been continuously demanded over a period of time. So the accountability of the police is something that we have always seen has been in question, and the serious misconducts that have happened over the past is something that the Police Accountability Commission has tried to take over. So the reform has happened in the area of the first information report, that the lodging mechanisms, which has led to the introduction of something called as the EFIRs for minor offences. So the use of ICT, the use of technology within the FIRs has come about. There is a launch of a common nationwide emergency number. We are all aware of several emergency numbers that are there, so that the security needs of citizens can be taken into account, whether it is the women helpline, whether it is the citizens helpline, and various such other helpline numbers that are circulated all across the nation. When we talk about accountability, when we talk about responsiveness and transparency, something that administration over the years has tried to look into is the threat of corruption, the seeds of corruption, and the Lokpal and the Lokayukt. The Lokpal, the center, the Lokayukt at the state, has been looked into as anti-corruption bodies. So the grievance redressal mechanism is one of the key target areas of the good governance mechanism, and the grievance redressal mechanism is strengthened through these institutions so that the officials can be kept on check. The officials in these public organizations are able to be kept into control, and largely the idea of public interest gets fulfilled. So when we talk about the Lokpal, the Lokayukt, these anti-corruption bodies have somehow tried to enforce that administration is at all times under check, and the citizens have the power to bring in their grievances and get proper redressal mechanism. When we talk about good governance, we need to understand that the use of technology is something which is trying to effectively deal in strengthening good governance, and the National E-Governance Plan in 2006 has strengthened the electronic governance within the country. So using ICT for all governance services with the basic goal of providing quick, efficient, effective services to every area which is possible for the citizens is something that this ICT revolution, the e-governance revolution, has tried to bring about. So better programming mechanisms, better service delivery in this age of rising ICT demands, in this age of 5Gs and the rapid development of technology at every sphere today tries to strengthen the e-governance model. So the NEGP made maximum government services accessible to the common man in his locality through common service delivery outlets, which therefore has somehow led to a much more easier access of services. So gone are the days when one needs to go and submit their electric bills or their gas bills in the queue under the heat of the sun. In this scorching weather, one can just click the button through one's smartphone or through any UPI services or through the internet and easily can submit their requisite bills. All kinds of government application forms, whether it is the admission forms, whether it is the examination forms, any kind of entrances, etc., are all accessible through the click of a button. So therefore, electronic governance has played a very, very key role when it has come to the development of good governance. Moving on to something which is known as the Aspirational District Program, the ADPs. The ADPs were seen in the idea in 2018, and it focused on human development over economic growth. Very essentially important. The ADP was launched in January 2018 with the idea to transform the lives of people in especially the underdeveloped areas. So it was anchored by Niti Aayog. The program aimed at transforming almost 115 backward districts, which largely focused in the areas of health, nutrition, agriculture, water management, financial inclusion, education, and very important, skill development. So all these areas were focused when it talked about ADPs from the 2018 projects that were enhanced. And somehow these ADPs have also tried to strengthen the goals of the last point initiative that is discussed here, decentralization. When we talk about strengthening of decentralization, the local and urban governance, we need to understand that participation of the people, we began with this idea that the participation of the people builds the roots of good governance, and the essence of democracy lies within the structures of decentralization. So whether it is the local or the urban governance in the form of Panchayati Raj institution, municipals, the goal of democracy is only successful when the power is decentralized to the people, and when this decentralization is able to develop the needs, the goals of the people themselves. So the ADPs in fact have been aspirational also to bring about a strong process of decentralization. The most important idea that I would like to focus on this slide right now is, when we are moving towards the end of our presentation, is the idea of citizen-centric governance. Today, good governance is synonymous to the idea of a citizen-centric governance. And when we talk about public service delivery, this citizen-centric governance is possible and has to be strengthened when we are moving towards the larger goal of development. So various ideas have been discussed when we talk about citizen-centric governance. It is seen through the following divisions. First, citizens' charter, putting people first. Again and again, we are trying to say that we need to understand the fact that the citizens are the core essentials when we talk about good governance. So when the citizen is at the center, the citizens' charter puts people at the center, or put people at the first. So citizens' charter is a written declaration basically by the government departments, who enlist a set of commitments, and these commitments have standard sets of service delivery as well as remedial or redressal actions in case there is any kind of non-compliance. So this charter is trying to put again and again the citizen at the forefront, putting the people in the forefront, and stating that the set of commitments that have been declared in the citizens' charter is something that one needs to keep into mind while effectively delivering these services. Secondly, the Sevottam model. This model has focused on the quality management framework and is largely applicable to the public service delivery organization in all departments, all across the departments. So the service delivery excellence model provides a basic framework for these organizations to assess and improve the quality of service delivery to citizens. So when we talk about the quality factor, this model, this service delivery model has focused that, keeping in mind that quantity is always there, we need to understand that a qualitative allocation of services is something that good governance focuses on in terms of public service delivery. And with the market, with the private sector coming into action as an important stakeholder, CSR, or corporate social responsibility, is very important. It is a governance-centric approach to citizens' welfare. It is an obligation, in fact, on the part of the corporates to act in a manner which will best serve the interest of the society. And we all are aware that with the profit mechanisms, with the ever-rising development factors that are there, the competition that is there, somewhere the fear is that the public interest gets lost. So the idea of CSR, the acts of social responsibility by the corporates, is a commitment by these corporates to integrate social and environmental concerns, very, very crucial in today's terms, through effective accountability, transparency, commitment towards the public. So this responsibility is by the corporates towards its own citizen. Moving towards the end of my presentation, I have tried to highlight quickly some of the good governance programs in India that have recently structured the path of good governance. So one can see on the right hand of the slide that there are certain indicators that have been highlighted. So the goal of reform, perform, and transform is what the current government has been looking towards when it talks about good governance. And several of its schemes that have led to the strengthening of good governance has been highlighted through the data in the picture. But I would quickly go through these good governance programs in India. So starting with the vision of electronic governance 2015, Digital India has tried to connect all Indians through the digitization of government services, especially keeping in mind the pandemic. The Digital India has been extremely helpful and efficient in delivery of services. So with the pandemic, with people being isolated within their confines, the UPI, the mechanisms of electronic banking, etc., have really helped people, and therefore the mission of Digital India to connect all Indians all across the nation has been very successful over the period of time. The Ayushman Bharat is a national health protection scheme which is directly covering the vulnerable sections of the Indian population. So there is a rupees 5 lakh cover per year per family for such vulnerable sections. And we are already aware that India stands amongst the highest PPEs, that is the personal pocket expenditure when it comes to health facilities. Uh, Therefore, this scheme of providing a health coverage to the vulnerable section has been very important when we talk about public service delivery. The Ujjwala scheme in 2016 was able to in fact deliver 50 million LPG connections to women within the BPL group, and this has been a very big initiative and has really helped. So one can see in the image at the right hand side that the PM Ujjwala Yojana provided with 2.49 crore was able to provide free LPG connections to BPL families, and this data is latest till the 2017 which is mentioned in the picture. Swachhata Abhiyan, all across the nation, all the institutions have been a part of this national cleanliness campaign. People have come forward, institutions have come forward and taken the oath towards a better clean country, towards a better clean India. Digital lockers 2015 onwards, this digital repository of documents has been a very good initiative, and the accessibility factor is increased largely. Uh, Improving the situation of girl child, favoring gender inequality, Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao has been one of the strongest movements, empowering girls, especially the education factor. 2015 onwards, Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao has been a strong initiative which has directly looked towards the empowerment of girls. Jan Dhan Yojana 2015 onwards, bank account for every citizen within the country. So having your own bank account, being able to save, being able to look into your finances is what Jan Dhan Yojana has been able to envisage. So 28.99 crore has been invested in this scheme. Make in India, FDI, various startups, various Startup India, Mudra Yojana, all of these mechanisms has been able to build entrepreneurs within the country amidst large-scale global forces. So the entrepreneurship skills, the entrepreneurial forces have been able to develop within our country 2014 onwards, and has been a very big achievement when it comes to the good governance parameters. Lastly, GST, we all are aware of. Good governance directly looks into the mechanisms of the government prospects. So this indirect taxes has in fact been defined as a value-added tax. So just few programs have been highlighted within this presentation, and one can conclude that the current mantra of Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, Sabka Vishwas is the essence that good governance in India is currently looked towards. It is trying to look towards reformation. It is trying to focus on something as performance. It is trying to finally transform the old orthodox barriers and bring about a change, so that when we move towards the 2030 index, when we move towards the idea of good governance, sustainability, the goal of Viksit Bharat in 2047, we can conclude that the good governance framework has been able to and will be able to strengthen the pace of development, accelerate the pace of development within our country. So the Good Governance Index, which was launched on 25th December, acts as a uniform tool, in fact, across the states to assess the status of governance and its various interventions. and the 10th Good Governance Day was in fact celebrated in 2023. The goal to become a developed nation 100 years from independence is a very big challenge. We all are aware of it. But it can only be achieved when we have the right mindset, we have people's participation, and this is only possible when we talk about good governance. The pace of development has to be accelerated. As the former Vice President Venkaiah Naidu stated, that delivery is the key, the last mile is the goal. It is very difficult to reach the last mile, but the good governance structure will definitely will be able to strengthen this system. The low-hanging fruits are very easy, as he says. We should not be satisfied with just that initial success, leaving no one behind and ensuring that we achieve growth with equity is crucial for social harmony, sustainability, and peaceful development. So, with these words of our former Prime Minister, I would like to finish my lecture.